Lovely to meet you. Welcome.
Lovely to meet you too.
Yeah. So
Cheers.
good day. Have a seat.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Your chair. We're having a chat today with Queensland Greens MP Amy McMahon. Amy was elected as the member for South Brisbane in the 2020 state election about nine months ago. Amy attended State High School before moving to South Brisbane about 10 years ago and has studied at the University of Queensland. She has a Bachelor of Arts, a Bachelor of Social Science honours and a Doctorate of Philosophy, Sociology, and comes to her role with a background in research, teaching and community work. Perhaps most importantly, Amy is a carer, an auntie, shout out to all the aunties, and an activist. Amy is one of the few members of Queensland Parliament who doesn't take any corporate donations, which is great, and is deeply committed to fighting for the people of South Brisbane and the everyday Queenslanders. Amy is also the Queensland Greens spokesperson for Treasury, Essential Services, Housing and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Partnerships. Welcome, Amy, to your office. Thank you for having us here today.
Thanks for having me.
It's good to sit down and have a chat. So to get started, I wanted to hear a little bit about your journey into politics after all your study and what brought you here.
Yeah. I always had a sense that I would be involved in social change in some form. My dad had been very interested in environmental issues, even though he worked in mining. He worked in copper mining and petroleum, but you know, had this thought at the back of his head that there wasn't something quite right, and that influenced me a lot. So I always had this sense that my life would involve social change in some form, and when I was graduating from high school was when a lot of issues around Australia's treatment of refugees was kicking off. There was the Tampa and Civex incidents, and I got really interested in refugee rights at that point, which led me into studying Bachelor of Social Science, looking at international development. And at that point, I thought I would, travel the world. I would be breaking down capitalism and colonisation and, these big social structures. And that influenced me a lot. I was lucky enough to travel to Bangladesh after I finished my my bachelor degree, and I went over there on a program that was run by the federal government. It was called AYAD at the time. I think it's called something different now, but it has the very naff name, Australian Youth Ambassadors for Development. And that was 10 years ago this year. So this is a kind of special milestone for me, and I headed over with 13 other young Australians to Bangladesh to work with an NGO called CARE, doing research and communications work for them, building on what I'd learnt in my degree. Obviously, I was exceptionally naive when I got to Bangladesh and realised how much I had to learn about the world, how much I had to learn about research, but found myself in an incredibly supportive team and network of people, and particularly women, who really have influenced me still to this day. And my experiences in Bangladesh of seeing the levels of poverty up close, but also seeing, amazing social movements and resilience and strength and incredible work that people were doing, had a big impact on me. One of the bits of work that CARE was doing was they were trying to quantify the economic impact of domestic violence in Bangladesh, and they were interviewing women and families right across the country, and they came back with this staggering figure that domestic violence was costing Bangladesh about 2% of their GDP a year, more than was being spent on other major social services. And that got me really interested in thinking, maybe research is a kind of pathway for change. And so I went back home and I got a chance to do a PhD looking at climate change in Bangladesh. So I got to go back to Bangladesh and talk to women farmers about their experiences of climate change and what was going on for them. And when I came home, our mother fell ill. She had a stroke. And she became fairly severely disabled. And straight away, a lot of my plans for life were put on hold as we were helping her navigate a healthcare system that is very hostile and doesn't provide the resources that you really need as a person with a disability to find housing, to get the direct support that you need, and just the kinds of challenges around discrimination that you face. And that had a huge impact on me and a huge impact on my family as well, and shaped my politics even more so. And it was around that time that other friends of mine were involved in the Greens. I knew our local councillor here, Jonathan Sri, from university. Just in a way that lots of people knew Jonathan, because he was a well-known figure on campus. And a handful of other people in the Greens as well. And they said, why don't you get involved, help out this campaign. And it was like I had been looking around for where I was going to make an impact in the world and what pathway would be the most powerful for me to make change. And it was like, okay, here it is. Here is the opportunity and the pathway. And thinking about my own theory of change and how you create social justice and create change, I thought this is the place. And I never had ambitions to be an MP, even at that point. I thought I will be a support role and I will help with campaigns and maybe I will do research. But the opportunity came up to run for pre-selection, and I thought this is an opportunity I can't pass up. And so ran in the 2017 election. We got very close, but didn't quite get there. And then last year in 2020, off the back of a huge, vibrant grassroots campaign, we were able to secure the seat. And now I have the incredible opportunity and privilege to represent the people of South Brisbane.
I do believe I saw you one day hammering a post in putting up one of your signs in the front yard, and you gave me a big hello and a wave, and I was like, I think that's the lady on the on the poster.
Doing
so
a lot of hands-on work. Absolutely,
yeah, that's fantastic. And your time in Bangladesh, you've talked about a little bit, but very brave. I've been there myself, and I was there for 2 weeks, but a whole year is like, wow, that's challenging. So I can imagine that shaped a lot. And you brought a lot back from
absolutely.
That would have shaped how you saw the world.
Yeah, so. Absolutely.
And what if you've talked a little bit about the key influence that brought you to be part of the Greens. One of the things I just came across recently that my sister highlighted to me was the democracy policy that the Greens have. In 2018, Stan Grant wrote an interesting piece, and he spoke about it in a few places, I think. It was reported quite widely about the increasing threat to democracy globally, with identity politics dividing societies, the increasing erosion of human rights, rising inequality, and the wave of populism shaking up the world order. We've now got the increasing influence of China, COVID, still that runoff of GFC, which was probably still happening, but then COVID hit and everyone forgot about the GFC. And then while he identified that Australians are politically active, at the ballot box at least, they're not. They've got a disaffection for politics. So I guess, can you talk us through that democracy policy and that desire to engage people more in the democratic process?
Absolutely, yeah. The Greens have been looking really closely at what is going on politically around democracy, people's engagement with politics, and looking at the evidence that we have for the last 50 years. And what we've been reflecting on is the way in which historically people were connected to politics through established organisations and social movements, maybe through your trade union or through your church or through robust community organisations that existed, through the 60s and 70s and 80s, really strong protest movements, for example. But what we've seen in the last few decades is a lot of that really declining. Trade union membership is very low. I think about only 14% of Australians are a member of a trade union. And these traditional ways through which people engaged with each other and they engage with politics and they engage with their representatives has changed a lot and has really declined. And at the same time, our politicians have kind of withdrawn from communities that without that kind of avenue that you have to the grassroots. We've seen this real professionalisation of politics, and there's an expectation that you need to be a lawyer and you need to look and sound a particular way. And we've always had, politics has always been a space for very privileged people, but now we see this group of people who are very disconnected from what's going on the ground and much more connected to big corporations where, they're mixing with people, they're going to the same schools as people who end up as the CEOs of banks and mining corporations. There's the influence of corporate donations and these networks become very strong, and we're seeing the ways in which politics now is much more driven through this corporate space than driven by the needs of people on the ground and responding to what's going on in communities at the grassroots. And a lot of people know this kind of, they can kind of know it inherently that this is what's going on. And for so many people, they're just kind of fed up with politics. When we go and knock on people's doors, which is one of the key ways in which we engage with people, and one of the first questions that I like to ask is, how do you feel about politics in general at the moment? And the most common response is someone just giving you a very wry laugh and saying, it's a joke. These people are out for themselves. They're taking all this money. They're flying around in helicopters. They're getting gifted holidays, and they're taking these big corporate donations, and they're making decisions that, let these companies get richer and richer. And while us on the ground, wages haven't been increasing. Our hospitals are really struggling. Our education system is underfunded. Even around here in a very wealthy neighbourhood, you can see that things aren't being maintained. Our green space is being squeezed. Our schools are really struggling. And so people, they have this sense that politics is kind of letting them down. And for a lot of people, their response is well, I'm just going to withdraw from this process. I'll vote because I have to, which is kind of one of the really good things, I think, of the Australian system, where you, at the very least, you're required to go to the ballot box, whether or not you just scratch a swear word on it or vote, but you have to go there. So they'll engage on election day, but they won't necessarily be thinking about it beforehand, not necessarily having conversations with their friends and family about it. For a lot of people, they're making their final decision on election day as they're walking down to the ballot box. And our response to people is your instincts about the political process are right. This process is a joke in a lot of ways. And it isn't serving the needs of everyday people. It's really serving the needs of these big corporations. And you feel that. And part of what we do when we go and talk to people is we say, you've got this feeling, and this is where it comes from, putting it in context, saying the major parties are just, the political wing of Santos and Rio Tinto. They're not really working for you. And so being able to articulate what people are feeling and then saying, but there is another option. There's another way to do politics that is engaged, but we need you on board. We can't do it alone. We need a network of people on the ground connected to each other who are going to fight for the things that we need. And showing people, look, you're not alone. There's lots of other people who feel the same way. If you get involved, we can make some really amazing change for Queensland, for Australia, for the world. And sort of opening that up. And so that's part of what the Greens have been trying to do, I guess, in the grassroots. And then at the policy level, talking about things like banning corporate donations as a way to improve our political system. We've been proposing, should 16-year-olds be able to vote? They're already being affected by the world, they're working, they're paying tax, they're using public transport, they're very aware of what's going on. Should they be able to be involved as well? And these kinds of measures that would transform politics into something that works for everyday people and not just for the big end of town.
Yeah, that's great. That's really good. The hot topic today is the Olympics announcement, South East Queensland and Brisbane 2032, we have them, which I don't think was a surprise to anyone. And maybe there was some risk that we weren't going to, but I think everyone assumed it was in the bag a little bit,
right.
Despite the warnings it might not be. With a number of key venues earmarked for South Brisbane, including a redevelopment of the Gabba, you recently held a community consultation session to identify concerns in the community about the potential impacts on existing community activities, green spaces, businesses and housing that will be impacted. I actually attended myself, and speaking of the getting people involved, walked in thinking I'd just slip in at the back and have a listen, and it turned out to be like a workshop, and I was at the front and I had to actually get involved, and I was like, oh, the Greens are really sucking me in, and the lady next to me was like, oh, I thought I could sneak in too, and I'm like, well, here we are. But it was great, it was actually really great, and to sit down and talk to other people about what they were thinking, and there was diverse opinions, and just to really get a sense and actually be involved, I thought was actually quite cool.
Yeah.
Out of that though, where do you feel like the community is at, and we have the Olympics and we can fight certain things, but what's your vision for how we now use them? I think one of the quotes from Phil at Kurilpa Futures was, how do we milk the cow rather than letting the bull run all over us, which I thought was great.
Right. Yeah, so we will be the host of the Olympics. It's very likely that the Gabba Stadium just down the road will be the main stadium at the cost of $1 billion. And, how will this community be engaged, and how will we be affected by a major international event? One of our big concerns to date is that there's been no consultation with anyone, not in this community, not in anyone else in Queensland. There's never been an opportunity for anyone to say whether we want the Olympics or not. It's just sort of been like, this is a thing that we're going to push for, but no feedback from the community. Is this how we want billions of dollars spent? I got the opportunity to ask the Premier this question last week in estimates hearings, and I said, what consultation has been done? And her response was, there's been a lot of media coverage, which isn't consultation at all. This isn't a dialogue, that's just a sharing of information. And if you really care about what the community thinks, and you really want to uphold democracy and be reflecting what the community needs, you need to go and talk to people. And so that's one of the key things we're going to be pushing for, this community that will shoulder the weight of a major international event with a huge amount of change that will happen to this community: infrastructure, property development, hotels, the impact on our roads, the impact on our schools. If we're going to shoulder an event like this, we need to have a say, and we need to have a seat at the table, and we need to be listened to in terms of the things that we need to make sure that we can get through this event as a coherent community. Looking at evidence from similar events, Olympics and other major events in other parts of the world, we know that there can be really negative impacts. A lot of evidence to show that there's upward pressure on house prices, rates and rents, which is a big concern for us. 60% of people in this neighbourhood are renters. Will they be able to stay here? Will they be priced out? Will this neighbourhood completely transform? Will, migrant communities and other vulnerable communities be forced out of what should be a very inclusive neighbourhood? The impact on the local school, East Brisbane State School, right next to the Gabba Stadium. They really want that school to stay there. The school community want the school to stay there. And there's a big question mark about whether that will be allowed to happen as the stadium redevelops. Can you have a school coexist with a major stadium? And for us, we'll be fighting to make sure that that school stays there. The impact on other green space, the impact on roads and traffic, the impact on small businesses, the experience from the Commonwealth Games, was abysmal for small businesses because everyone left town and there was hardly anyone there, and a lot of small businesses really struggled. There's also pretty scant evidence to show that there's a real big boost in tourism or even the economic benefits that are being touted by the government. And so digging into some of that to see what's the evidence that this event will have a huge boost on jobs and economic benefit for the state. We absolutely need jobs in Queensland, absolutely. We're in a pretty desperate situation. But there's lots of other things you could do with $1 billion or with billions of dollars that would create lots of long-term sustainable jobs. One of the things that I've been reflecting on a lot is if you invested that money in schools or if you've invested that money in childcare, things that people really need that, you know, isn't a big flashy announcement, but really makes a transformative difference for people's lives. So this is some of the stuff that we'll be pushing for. We are going to get the Olympics, and so our job now is to make sure that this community gets what it needs, has a seat at the table, has that investment back in infrastructure, so that this community can stay together and people aren't just forced out and the neighbourhood is completely transformed by property developers.
Yeah. I actually heard a business person, quite a high-profile business person from the local community, well, our local Brisbane community, broader community, speaking this morning saying supportive of the Olympics, but really identified again the government's, the money they use. They don't run businesses. The government comes in and they may set up this event, but it's now up to us to hold them accountable to how that money's spent.
That's right.
And I guess that's part of the tourism and how do we enable businesses to actually make the most of the Olympics so that it isn't, we don't have the same issues that other cities have had. Yeah. So hopefully we will get some of those benefits.
Yeah.
So moving over to renters' rights, with the current impact as we're already seeing post-COVID because of everyone moving to Brisbane, because why not? But rents are already going up with this announcement with the Olympics. You've been talking about renters' rights and not getting costing out. So can you talk to us a little bit about the rental reform bill I think you've just presented to Parliament and how that process is going?
Yeah, we've been looking a lot at the kind of experience of renters in Queensland at the moment. About 36% of Queenslanders rent. It's the biggest proportion of people in terms of housing tenure. So there's a lot of renters and there's a lot of people for whom renting is a long-term option. It's no longer just a short-term thing. There's families renting, there's kids who go to school from rental homes, people are growing up there, and this is a long-term option. But for a lot of renters, things are really tough. Rents are rising faster than wages. A lot of people have experience of really difficult situations with landlords and real estate agents. A lot of people living in houses that are run down and unmaintained, and then when they go and ask for maintenance, being bullied or threatened with eviction, or just fearing that eviction and so never coming forward to say that there are problems. We've heard all sorts of stories. We've been gathering feedback from people over the last few months, people being told, oh, the kitchen sink doesn't work, you've got a sink in the bathroom, what's the problem? People being told, oh, that hole in the floor, well, you don't need to walk there, just walk around it. People having to cut grass that was growing through the floor in the kitchen, people falling down and getting hurt, people having their rents rising so drastically that they were forced out of a property, and people not being able to make minor modifications that would make their home safe. Heard from a woman in a wheelchair who wanted to put a grab rail in the shower to make it safe for her to shower, and the landlord said no, which this is opposed to human rights. And this is a situation for so many people. This isn't an unusual situation. Nearly every renter that I know will have at least one terrible story, and I have some of my own stories. And so we have been pushing for change, and the government have been indicating that they've been receptive to some reforms in the rental space. They did pretty big tranche of consultation about 2 years ago and came out with what looked like some pretty progressive reforms around renters' rights, but in response to a very vigorous campaign from the real estate lobby, and in particular the Real Estate Institute of Queensland, a lot of that was watered down, and a lot of key measures like being able to make minor modifications were taken out of the government's bill. We've put in another bill that is much more progressive and much more in line with what we think renters need, things like a cap on rent increases, expanding the minimum standards for homes, making it easier for people to rent with pets, so saying that having a pet is the kind of default option, banning things like rent bidding, which is where people go and they say, I'm willing to pay an extra $20 a week if I can secure this property, which is pricing other people out. Banning invasive questions from real estate agents, and also requiring that people have information about whether there's been mould in the property in the past, or whether there's asbestos, or whether there's body corporate disputes, things that would put tenants in a better position to know what they're getting into. So these two bills are before government at the moment. They're being reviewed by a government committee of MPs in tandem, and we've gotten the opportunity to really press the government on some of the measures that they're missing from their bill, and what this will mean for renters. One of the big gaps is that the government still have options for landlords to kick people out without any cause. So you've been paying your rent, the property's well maintained, your lease comes to an end, and that alone is grounds for you to be evicted. What we've been arguing, and a lot of other people in the sector have been arguing, is that that shouldn't be grounds for eviction. And once you're in a rental property, you should be able to stay there. Of course, with options if the landlord wants to move back in, or if they want to make major renovations, they can take back possession of the house. But in the absence of that, there's no real reason why people should be asked to leave. You know, why kick out families and force kids to go to different schools? Why make people have to travel even further to get to work, or uproot themselves from their communities or services that they're accessing? A lot of, you know, really vulnerable communities who might be accessing a local community centre or DV services, and then they're forced to start all over again in another community. And for a lot of tenants, moving around is one of the most stressful things. I think moving, we all know, is horrendously stressful. The average rental length in Queensland for a home is 17 months, and for a unit it's 13 months. And so that's how often people are moving. If you own your own home, the average length of tenure is 11 years. And so the experience of owning your own home or being a tenant is so different. And tenants are just in this incredibly precarious situation. So we're pushing the government to put in some of the things that we've suggested into their bill. There are some really good measures in the government's bill, particularly around allowing people in a DV situation to leave a tenancy or to change the locks. And so we're really thankful for that, but there's a whole lot of stuff that's missing. That means that the voices of renters have really been ignored. And as you mentioned, there's so many people coming to Queensland. The situation is becoming more and more squeezed. Rents are just going up and up and up because this is what the market is saying is allowed. There's no measures to put a cap on that, or to deal with it, or to make it easier for people to find properties. So we're working really hard. We've gotten a lot of renters to write in their stories and to get in touch with their MPs to try and push for some of this change.
Yeah, that's really great. And we talked a little bit just before we started about the Greens plan for 25,000 jobs for 20,000 homes. Can you tell us what's behind that?
Yeah.
Plan?
The other big thing we've been pushing for is investment in social housing. So we've got, at the moment, there's about 47,000 people on the list for social housing. This includes children, it includes people who've been waiting for homes for years. And these are people in really vulnerable situations. They might be homeless, or they're in insecure housing at the moment, or they're couch surfing, they have low income, or they have other vulnerabilities. They might have illness, or they've been dealing with trauma or a history of DV. And, you know, these people are just waiting to see if they can get a secure home that they can afford. And this is a massive, massive issue in Queensland at the moment. There's so many people waiting for homes, so many more people who don't even apply because they know it's going to be so difficult and are just competing in a worsening private rental market. And so we've been saying we need pretty urgent investment in more social housing straight away. You know, the best way to house someone is to basically give them a home. We know this is the cheapest option as well. So we've been saying, we've put forward a proposal, 25,000 homes a year, which would create 20,000 jobs over a 4-year period. You know, you'd create thousands of jobs that Queenslanders really need at the moment, but you'd also be creating homes for people who really need it. And this would have a huge amount of flow-on benefits for the community. You know, savings in the healthcare sector, savings in the mental health care sector, savings in the justice system as well. If you provide people with safe, secure, comfortable housing, a lot of social housing at the moment is very run down as well. It's in very poor shape. If you could create these beautiful homes, they're energy efficient, it's a lovely place to come home to. It would have all these other benefits for society.
Yeah, and I think that a stable home will also help stable work as well.
Exactly.
Makes, like, one less pressure, doesn't it? So that's good for the economy as well as having people in jobs. So development in South Brisbane is a really hot topic, I guess, and has been for a number of years. We've seen an increasing number of developments coming in. Developers starting to push the envelope on height limits and neighbourhood plans, just discarding them really. So you've been quite active in that space along with Jonathan Shree. The current one that I'm aware of, because I live quite close by and love the Davies Park markets, is down on Montague Road with a protest on Saturday. So can you tell us a little bit about that one in particular, because I think that's quite a striking one with the proposal, but also just broadly around this area up to Woolloongabba. What do we need to do to keep the balance right between the needs of needing more places to live, but also making sure that the community is retained? Yeah,
absolutely. We definitely need more investment in housing. As I mentioned, social housing, but private dwellings as well. You know, we know there's huge numbers of people coming to Queensland. We know there's lots of people who want to live in this lovely neighbourhood as well, and providing options for more people to come into the neighbourhood is really important. It's also a priority for the government. But how we do that is the real question. Can we do it in a way that's sustainable, that responds to the needs of the existing community, and it is done in a way that's fair and just and affordable for people as well? What we've seen in this neighbourhood is, because this historically was, an old working class neighbourhood, there was a lot of industrial areas, and developers have really been able to come in and capitalise on this neighbourhood, and they've been able to capitalise on the fact that there's lots of loopholes in our planning system from both the state government and the council to really get whatever they want at very little cost to them. They've been able to build properties higher and wider than what's specified in existing neighbourhood plans. And they're able to do that because our planning system is what's called a performance-based planning system, where developers can argue, well, we meet these other objectives if we're able to build higher, and so you should allow us to do that. And there's nothing really in the legislation for council to say no, unless it's like particularly extreme. But we've seen a lot of very extreme developments approved, and the one down at Davies Park that you've mentioned is one of those examples that, within a performance-based planning scheme, the government could approve these two 25-storey towers on a site that is only zoned for 12 stories, and that could kind of happen under the rules that we have at the moment. When you've got property developers who are very wealthy and they have the legal knowledge and they know how to write things in a particular way, and then you have council who really don't have many tools to push back, or even the will, when they're also, have historically taken money from property developers, and there's these really tight ties there, and ideological views around looking after the big end of town and what that will mean for the broader community. pushing back is really tough. And so the community have been mobilising a lot over the last few years. We've started to see a lot of development pop up, particularly with no investment back into public infrastructure. So, our schools have been calling out and saying we're reaching capacity. The green space is getting more and more squeezed. Our footpaths and roads are getting very dated as there's more and more traffic. Things like bike lanes and active transport, there's very little of that. And this huge growing population of people who've come here to enjoy, this lovely neighbourhood and enjoy the river. But what investment is there back into the community to accommodate all of this and to, be maintaining that sense of community that people come here for, and the risks of that being eroded if there's no sort of attention and investment back in this community. And so people have been quite vocal and mobilised around this, particularly because this affects people's day-to-day lives. This is your daily experience of waking up and, you're wiping the dust off your veranda from the next door construction site, and then you're in a traffic jam just to go down one road to get out of the peninsula. And, your kids are going to a school where, at the local school here, there was like alternating times to use the oval because they didn't have enough space for the kids down there. And buses that are really slow and running late, and lots of people trying to move around. And this is people's lived experiences of unsustainable development, of developers just being able to do what they want, to make huge amounts of money off our neighbourhood and not give a huge amount back. And so this has been really a key thing for us, highlighting the fact that there's these really close relationships between our major parties and property developers in particular, and the way in which that has influenced decision making. We can see it and we can feel it, and it's our daily experiences. And for a lot of people, that is a pathway into politics. It's a pathway to seeing a bigger system, being able to very tangibly see how this broken system is impacting on our neighbourhood.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the development at Davies Park is particularly striking because of the markets there, which after losing the Boundary Street markets with West Village,
That's
I think
right. Yeah.
everyone who loves the sense of community down there is like, no.
Yeah.
Protect that sense, because even
Yeah.
though they will still continue, it will change the dynamic. And
Yeah. You'll be in the shadow of two 25-storey towers of luxury apartments. This isn't affordable housing.
Yeah.
The top level are like double level luxury apartments with their own swimming pool. Like, how is this consistent with what we're trying to do here, which is make this a really inclusive community? Who can afford that? Like, there's so many empty apartments around here as well. Like, even the stuff that isn't built to be luxury is still unaffordable to so many people.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, not the right balance.
Yeah.
With the increase in density, obviously you mentioned the public transport, and we do have the Brisbane Metro, which we'll go through, which will be a bit noisy, but anyway, Cross River Rail's happening.
Yeah.
So there are some broader city changes which will help.
Yeah.
But locally we've seen ferry terminals closed, I think Dockside's closed. And now I think this week it's come out that the state government actually hasn't confirmed funding for the green bridges that the Brisbane City Council had proposed. So they were the state was going to provide a third. So I guess a couple of questions there is that there was some consultation around those green bridges and their landing points. And then what do you envisage we need? What are the priority areas, I guess, for public transport and active transport in the area?
Yeah. The green bridges are pretty exciting. We've been talking about more options for people to be able to cross the river. There was a lot of discussion around the landing points, and it is a really tricky discussion. One of the things we've been pushing for is there should be no net loss of green space. Make sure any trees or green space that are taken out are replaced somewhere else. And making sure these are really well accessible, that you can, get off a bus and get onto the bridge, or it's really easy for you to ride your bike down or walk down or push a wheelchair or pram down. That other kind of investment that will make sure those bits of infrastructure are really well used. seems to be a little bit lacking at the moment. And as you mentioned, the council have put a lot of time and effort and have committed funding to it, and are expecting the state government to come to the table as well. And there's definitely a lot of tension between these two bodies about who's going to fund what. There's a similar argument going on down at Kangaroo Point for a river walk that has been talked about for a decade. The state government have put in money and they're saying council needs to come to the table. And people don't really care where money comes from. They just want to know that someone is going to pay for it, and the kind of infrastructure that we need will actually be built, without us having to fight for decades and be without it. So I think, that there are some really exciting opportunities with those green bridges, but there's a lot of other connectivity that we really need. We've got a public transport system in Brisbane that is still this really old model that assumes everyone's sort of going into the CBD and going back out again. No real networks that are kind of linking suburbs, linking people. I live in Woolloongabba. If I wanted to catch a bus to my office, which is like a 20-minute drive, I'd have to catch a bus to the cultural centre, get off, cross over, get on another bus. It would be double the time than if I jumped in the car, and that just seems absurd. So we've been looking at a lot of these kind of cross-suburb networks and putting a few proposals for particular networks that we think would be really useful, but also for existing networks to make sure that they're running really regularly, that there's nighttime services, that there's weekend services. There's a handful of buses around here that people would use a lot more if the services were better. And pushing the state government to say, there's no people using it now because it's a really lousy service, but if it was a good service, more people would use it, when often their argument is like, well, no one's using it, so why should we fund it? Which misses the fact that, there's a lot of people just self-excluding because it's not, not a good use of time. And for a lot of people, it's also quite expensive. But Brisbane has a pretty expensive public transport network. If you're an adult getting into the city, it's incredible how much money you can spend. We've been pushing for a free public transport system, which wouldn't cost a huge amount of money and would have a huge boost in patronage, people getting on the buses, and the savings we'd make from getting people out of their cars, easing pressure on the roads would be huge. For me, it seems quite logical, but you are pushing back against a system that is privatised in a lot of ways. Our GoCard system is a private company that's making money from charging us to use public transport. There's a lot of other companies involved. And should this be a money-making venture? I don't think so.
Yeah, public infrastructure, that's tricky.
Mm.
And lastly, I guess nearly a year in the role, not quite, but what's your broader vision for the community and people of South Brisbane? What would you like to continue to see happening or to continue to bring to the table to enhance the community that we have here?
Yeah, I think making sure that we are really listening to the community and reflecting those views in Parliament and in the work that we're doing in the community. But we've talked about public transport, that's still a big issue for people, managing development and then having investment in things that would make this neighbourhood really lovely, more parks, more active transport, places for people to gather and meet. And that's kind of the micro level. There's a lot of bigger things that we want to be pushing for around, affordable housing and renters' rights, making sure people can stay in this neighbourhood, that we've got the investment in social housing that people really need. And then the kind of very big picture around jobs and welfare, making sure that people have the resources that they need to lead a good life and that they can access really good free healthcare, really good free education. Those essential public services are free and fully funded and easy for anyone to access anywhere in Queensland. That's kind of the big picture stuff. A lot of this stuff is sort of big structural change that we'll be pushing and chipping away at for many years. But in the meantime, there's a lot of really good work to be done just with individuals in the community, and a lot of what my office does is supporting people with all sorts of different issues, people who are trying to navigate the healthcare system, or they're trying to navigate the aged care system, or they're trying to deal with like parking issues or amenity, or they've got complaints with particular companies that they're trying to deal with. So a lot of what we do is really like that very individual grassroots stuff, but being able to offer people that support and service is I think a really important part of what we're doing, being able to use the networks that we have to help people with visas, to help people get appointments at the hospital, that kind of stuff. So while we chip away at the big picture, and we try and transform Queensland's economy, and we try and make sure big corporations are paying their fair share, we're doing all this work with individuals on the ground. That's really rewarding.
That's fantastic. I think that's all we have for you today, but thank you so much for your time and for everything you're doing for our community.
Thank you.
And we look forward to seeing the inroads that you make as well.
Thanks very much.
Yeah, thank
Cheers.
you.